So are you going to introduce, Alex is going to introduce me. Okay.
What's the cue, sorry? Are we recording now? Okay. So it's a pleasure to introduce today our speaker, Aapo Hyvärinen, who's Professor of Computer Science for Machine Learning at the University of Helsinki, and until recently a professor at the Gatsby Computational Neuroscience Unit at UCL. So Professor Hyvärinen is well known for his work in unsupervised learning. In particular is the creator of the fast independent component analysis algorithm for linear source separation, which I know quite a few of us here are very familiar with. He's also authored the book Independent Component Analysis, which is a core reference on the subject. Alongside this achievement, Professor Hyvärinen is also the inventor of noise contrastive estimation, which was actually one of the direct inspirations for generative adversarial networks. More recently, his work's focused on nonlinear source separation, and in particular theoretical conditions under which these models can be made identifiable. This has led to a development of a number of contrastive learning methods, as well as a unifying framework with variational autoencoders. So he's here with us today to present his research on nonlinear independent component analysis using temporal structure. And also it's going to briefly relate how this can relate to neurophysiological recordings, in particular EEG and MEG. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Aapo Hyvärinen.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, I'm very pleased to give this talk here, and particularly I'm flattered because I've been told that I actually was voted by students to give among, I'm sure, a huge number of candidates. So I will first try to share my screen. Okay, can you see my slides perfectly well? Alex?
Yeah, that all looks good.
Okay, great. So yes, I will be talking about a nonlinear independent component analysis with applications to EEG and MEG. Well, I will start with a very short introduction to deep learning in general, and I will emphasize the importance of unsupervised learning in particular. People often use the term disentanglement here, which is kind of a very loose designation for methods trying to find independent factors. And well, this is exactly what we are talking about here. In the linear case, in fact, independent component analysis can be seen as a method for disentanglement, and it has been quite successful. So then obviously that raises the question whether we can extend it to a nonlinear method. Well, it turns out that this is actually not as straightforward as it might seem. Such a nonlinear ICA is fundamentally an ill-defined problem. It is not identifiable. Identifiability is a core concept here, which I will use many times. And well, I will define it in a while. Well, and the main solution that I'm going to talk about here is to use temporal structure in time series. Two different kinds of temporal structure actually enable us to surmount this problem of non-identifiability. And well, that's kind of the theoretical work on identifiability then actually more or less leads directly to estimation methods. Many of them belong to this currently fashionable self-supervised category, and also I have one based on VAE, as Alex mentioned. And here and there I will actually show method applications to EEG and MEG. I think it's a very promising method, although we certainly have only kind of scratched the surface on these applications for the moment. So I will start from the very basics, artificial intelligence. Well, we all have seen recently great successes of artificial intelligence. There's great promise in things like autonomous vehicles, machine translation, game playing, and search engine, which is kind of an underestimated form of actually rather great artificial intelligence. Well, and most of these modern applications and the whole boom that we are now experiencing is really based on deep learning. So what deep learning means basically neural networks, deep neural networks, where a neural network, or well, more strictly speaking, an artificial neural network is basically a general purpose method for approximating nonlinearities. It's kind of a recursive layer-wise method for approximating nonlinearities, where each layer makes a linear transformation followed by a very simple pointwise nonlinear transformation. Like here, we could use the very well-known half-wave rectification function called ReLU in this context. And so the fundamental theory that goes back to 1989 at least, maybe earlier, is that when you have enough of layers or enough of units actually, then you can approximate any kind of a nonlinear input-output mapping. And in practice, it turns out to be a very practical way of approximating nonlinear mappings in very high-dimensional spaces. Then, neural network is actually fundamentally only a way of approximating a nonlinear function, but then you combine that with learning by introducing some kind of a statistical objective, for example, simply least squares if you want to do regression, and then you can learn all the weights in all the layers. You can actually learn some nonlinear function. And so deep learning is simply learning in a neural network with many layers. And what we see both theoretically and in practice is that with enough data, you can basically learn any kind of an input-output relationship. The most famous kind of applications that started the deep learning boom were something where you have images and then you classify those into categories, like shown in this picture, which comes from the famous paper by Krzyzewski, Sutskever, and Hinton in 2012. You can also predict stuff by having input as past and output as defined as present, or in a rather unsavory application, perhaps you can predict political views from your Facebook friends. Right, and basically, so the boom started because in this paper, the authors showed that with this kind of a learning system, you can actually achieve superior recognition success in well-known benchmark datasets for recognizing objects in images. So people had, of course, in computer vision spent huge amounts of work trying to somehow find, define nice features and design systems for object recognition. But the point here was that the authors actually showed that you can do that learning the system actually beats everything else. And that has apparently completely transformed computer vision, where now learning is something that people use for almost every topic. But okay, so that was the basic case of the most basic case of deep learning, which is what we call supervised learning. So that means that in those success stories, you actually have input and output. So you have basically inputs and some kind of a category labels typically, which say that whether the photograph depicts a cat or a dog, or maybe whether some input is liked or not liked on Facebook. But this kind of labels can actually be very, very difficult to obtain. In some cases, you may need, in many cases actually, you need human annotation. Like in a biomedical application, if you want to see whether some measurement is relevant for a diagnosis, you may need a medical expert to say that give this ground truth. And these labels may, even if you obtain them, may not be actually particularly informative in many cases. So this leads us to the question of unsupervised learning. So we only observe a data vector, we denote it here by X, but we observe not any kind of a label or target Y. For example, we might simply have photographs with no labels at all, nobody telling which one depicts a dog and which one is a cat. So this is basically a very difficult problem and largely unsolved. I would even say it's a very heterogeneous problem. It actually contains of many sub-problems which are only vaguely related to each other.
Sorry, you muted?
Aapo, you muted yourself.
The microphone?
Okay, yeah, I get a message that somebody in the meeting muted me. So I don't know what it means.
Sorry, so I might have pressed the wrong thing when I invited somebody who wanted to come in. So
Okay, yeah, okay. So which part did you not hear? Did you hear about the slide on importance of unsupervised learning?
Yeah, it was just the last 20 seconds you were muted.
Okay, so I will go to the slide ICA. Okay. Right. So yeah. So in machine learning, so this idea of unsupervised learning is of course as old as machine learning itself, and it has been, for example, people have developed the method of ICA, linear ICA, to solve that problem. So here's the definition of the basic linear ICA model. So we observed xi, which are, well, some input variables, for example, pixels in an image where I might index a pixel, and k is the index of kind of data point, for example, a photograph. And so the only thing we observe is x by definition, and what we want to do is to express that x, well, the whole data set of x's, as a linear decomposition of, well, a linear transformation of certain latent variables sj. And the linear transformation that transforms these latent variables, that is the hidden variables, into the observed variables is denoted by the coefficients a, I, j, called the mixing matrix. Now, the point here is that we assume that these latent variables sj are independent and, importantly, non-Gaussian. And in that case, under these assumptions, ICA is identifiable. So this is the key term here. It is identifiable or well-defined in the sense that observing only the x's, we can actually recover both the a's and the s's. This is an old result going back to Darnois and Skitovich around 1950, and then it was rediscovered in the context of actually signal processing and later machine learning by Comment. So I will very briefly explain the very fundamental difference of ICA and PCA. This may be well known to many readers. So here we assume that we have two independent components of uniform distributions in a certain interval. So then the distribution of the original components would look like this. Now what we observe is a linear transformation of that, and the data scatter plot would look like this. If we do PCA, we get a scatter plot which is like this, and so clearly we don't get the original components. But when we do ICA, we actually, in a sense, like rotate the PCA results and get the original components. Now, a well-known result, in fact, says that PCA or any form of ICA or factor analysis, which is almost the same thing, for Gaussian variables is not identifiable, because there is the well-known orthogonal rotation indeterminacy. If you have independent Gaussian variables of the same variance and you make an orthogonal rotation of the space, the distribution is exactly the same. I'm kind of trying to illustrate it by the scatter plot here, but well, you may not see very much. But then the red curves here show like the isocontours of the density function. So this rotation indeterminacy means that for Gaussian variables, the model is not identifiable, but then when you have non-Gaussian variables, like these uniform variables, it becomes identifiable. So what identifiability means is that ICA can do what we call blind spot separation. So in this very simple illustration, you might observe 4 signals like this, kind of at the same time, kind of on top of each other in a sense, for a 4-dimensional signal. Now, if you do PCA, you will not get anything really meaningful. But if you do ICA, you will see that you actually get 4 meaningful signals. So actually these 4 offset signals were linear combinations of these 4 source signals, even though you can't really see it, but ICA was able to recover them. So this can of course be directly applied to something like EEG or MEG. Here's actually data from MEG. So we took actually resting state recordings in MEG with 204 radiometer channels, and we did ICA and actually a certain variant of basic ICA, and then we found 9 components which were particularly stable according to a certain stability criterion. And what we see is that we actually get brain sources, some of which are actually well known. Like here we get like kind of a so this is kind of the MEG helmet seen from 3 different angles. We get something which is like on the right hand Rolandic area, somatosensory motor cortices. Here's the same thing on the left-hand side. So these are well-known mu rhythms, which is also seen in the Fourier amplitude. So some of these components are reasonably well-known sources, some of them are not. And of course, that's the most interesting thing, that we actually get something new, which might actually really reveal some completely new kinds of interesting sources in resting state data. A very different application is to do ICA on image patches so that you obtain image features. And actually, this is kind of relevant to biomedical engineering in the sense that you can use it for computational neuroscience modeling of the visual cortex. Actually, the features that you get are very similar to simple cells, simple cell receptive fields, but well, I will not go into details here. So now the hope would be that since we know that linear ICA is a good model for unsupervised learning in the linear case, so what if we could just do completely nonlinear ICA so that we basically approximate these nonlinear functions by neural networks and thus have a deep learning method that performs some kind of a general disentanglement, if you like that term. Well, unfortunately, that doesn't really work. It's not a straightforward problem, at least. If you make this very simple modification of the ICA model so that you simply, a very simple extension to the nonlinear case, so that you simply replace the linear mixing matrix by some arbitrary nonlinear functions fi here, so that each observed variable is some arbitrary nonlinear function of certain latent variables or independent components. Well, we cannot recover the original sources, that is, the model is not identifiable. This was actually, surprisingly, already proven by Darnois in 1952, the same person who proved the identifiability of linear ICA. He also proved the non-identifiability of nonlinear ICA. We kind of revived or rediscovered that proof much later. So here's an illustration. We have two independent components, where a scatter plot, which is colored only for the purposes of illustration. Now, a nonlinear mixture could have a very weird distribution like shown here. Now, we can actually find two independent components in the sense that they are completely independent of each other by learning certain nonlinear functions. But clearly, what we get here is not at all what we got here. We don't reproduce the same distribution, so we don't actually get the original independent components, which illustrates the non-identifiability. In fact, Darnois developed a kind of explicit construction how you can always do kind of a nonlinear function that gives you independent components. I will actually not go into details here. Well, if somebody's interested, you can go back into the recording. But okay. So that's kind of the negative part, the kind of a pessimistic part. So it seems that, well, we can't do nonlinear ICA. But in fact, well, as any mathematical counterexample, it of course has its limitation. In this case, that theory only applies for random variables. That is data that is IID sampled. So you get independent samples of the same random variables or random vector. What if we have time series, then it is not IID sampled, it's completely different. If you have a specific temporal structure, you might actually get something completely different, a completely different theoretical result. Well, here I'm going to talk about two fundamentally different forms of temporal structure. First, the classical autocorrelations, where simply two consecutive time points are correlated, like shown in these signals here. Or we can talk about non-stationarity, which is something where a very specific kind of non-stationarity here actually, where some of the parameters of the probability distribution of the independent components are changing as a function of time. So like here we have signals where the variance is changing. So here the variance is small, then it is big, and here the variance is kind of changing all the time from small to big and so on. In fact, in these particular two cases, the identifiability of nonlinear ICA can be proven. That's the topic of most of the rest of this talk, actually. So that means that for this kind of time-dependent sources or independent components, we can actually find the original sources from arbitrary nonlinear mixtures. Okay, so how does this work? Well, I'm going to talk about here about methods that use a certain algorithmic trick called self-supervised learning. Now, in fact, this algorithmic trick is not at all necessary. You can do nonlinear ICA without self-supervised learning, and I will actually, in the very end of this talk, I will talk more about that. But it's a kind of a funny trick, very useful in many ways, although usually very heuristic, but also kind of reasonably successful in many machine learning, many unsupervised learning problems in machine learning. So to explain the difference, I will first give the classical definition of supervised learning. So we have input X and output Y. For example, the input might be images and Y is a label of whether it's cats or dogs. Or in a neuroimaging context, you might have brain signals and experimental condition. Now, unsupervised learning, of course, as I said earlier, is something where we don't have this Y at all, we only have the input X. So now, self-supervised learning is that we actually only have an input variable, so I mean a single random vector X, but we somehow invent Y. We basically just use our imagination and invent somehow a supervised learning problem. For example, we might create some kind of a corrupted data, and once we have invented this Y, then we apply supervised algorithms. And if everything goes well, the supervised algorithm is kind of performing unsupervised learning at the same time. So one method for self-supervised learning that we proposed 10 years ago was called noise contrastive estimation, where the idea is very simple. We simply artificially generate noise, maybe like Gaussian noise, and then we train a neural network to solve the simple classification or discrimination task, so that for each data point it has to learn to tell whether it is real data or noise. And it turns out that, well, in this case, to perform this task successfully, the neural network has to learn something about the structure of the real data, how it is different from noise. And in fact, we then developed a theory showing that it is able to estimate unnormalized statistical models or energy-based models, but I will not go into that. But so our research on nonlinear ICA actually started a little bit kind of accidentally when we kind of looked at a certain kind of a self-supervised learning method, and then realized that, well, actually it is doing nonlinear ICA. So we started completely heuristically. Self-supervised learning always starts more or less heuristically. We started, well, let's take an n-dimensional time series, which was actually MEG, so I should perhaps mention what MEG is. So MEG is basically like EEG, so electrical brain signal, measurements of electrical brain signals, but just kind of a little bit more sophisticated than EEG. But okay, so once we have this data, how about we just divide this data into a number of time segments? In the simplest case, just take bins with equal sizes. And okay, now we can actually think of this, turn this into a classification problem where each input, each data point is actually one original X, but now we have created this label, which is the index of the segment. So the number of classes is exactly the same as the number of segments, and so this can be solved by what is called multinomial logistic regression in a neural network, actually a very classical way of training neural networks. And a neural network can always, well, if it's a big neural network at least, it can always be divided into kind of two parts. First, you have kind of a feature extractor, which is basically everything up to the last hidden layer, and then you have a last layer that actually does the classification. So now the question is that what should this feature extractor here, so the last hidden layer, basically learn to represent? Well, actually, logically, it has to learn to represent the non-stationarity in the data, because non-stationarity by definition is nothing else than the difference of the distributions between the different time segments, because non-stationarity means that the distribution changes as a function of time. So maybe this could actually do something like nonlinear ICA. So to our great surprise, we were able to show that it actually does. I will go very quickly through this theorem. It's a little bit heavy stuff, just to kind of show you what kind of a rigorous mathematical results you can actually obtain in this research line. So as always in the theory of ICA or similar methods, we assume that the data actually follows the model. So each x is obtained, with t is now the time index, is obtained as a smooth and invertible, but otherwise quite completely arbitrary general nonlinear function of certain independent components. And now the independent components in this case are seen to be non-stationary. In the simplest case, they would have changing variances, as I showed in a plot a while ago. And then assume that we apply this time contrastive learning on x with certain technical assumptions, for example, that we have a neural network, so multi-layer perceptron with a hidden layer, which has the same number of dimensions as the data. So then what we can prove is that TCL will actually converge so that the squares of the independent components are obtained as some unknown linear transformation of the outputs of the last hidden layer. So we have basically reduced the nonlinear ICA into something which is kind of which has only this linearity here and the pointwise nonlinearity. So TCL basically demixes the nonlinear ICA model up to linear mixing, but we know how to do the linear demixing anyway. That's the classical theory of linear ICA. The only thing that remains is the squaring, but well, in many applications that shouldn't be that serious. So what we have actually proven here is two things. First, time contrastive learning will perform nonlinear ICA, but also we have shown that actually the nonlinear ICA problem is solvable. That is, that the model is identifiable. Otherwise, of course, the proof would not be possible at all. So it's a constructive proof that shows the identifiability by showing that a particular algorithm achieves the identifiability or consistency of estimation, if you like. Now, intuitively, why would this work? Well, there's maybe a rather simple explanation, which is that we can basically impose independence. We can think of this, well, this is not something that the algorithm does, but theoretically, we could think that in the model, we can impose independence at every segment. So we have many more constraints than in the basic ICA case, where we can just impose independence for all the components globally. But here we can impose independence at every segment, so we get more constraints, and that makes it more plausible. It doesn't prove it, but it makes it more plausible that we actually have a unique solution, and that is identifiability. So as I said, we developed this method in the context of MEG. So we validated it in a simple way, which is that, well, we estimated the independent components or sources from resting data. That is data where the subject is not receiving any stimulation and has no task. Then we validated the data by in what might be called a semi-supervised setting, so that we took another set of data from the same subjects, where actually we know that there are four classes, basically 3 different classes of sensory stimulation and rest. And using the features, the nonlinear features estimated from resting state data, then we performed linear classification by an SVM. And the results are here, so that, well, we see, first of all, we see that TCL is better than competing deep learning methods. But also we see that when we increase the nonlinearity, so actually even the L1 here, L is kind of number of hidden layers, so even L1 is actually nonlinear here. But when we increase it even more, we actually get a little bit more performance. But we definitely get better results than with the linear method, which is kind of this one is the most comparable linear method. Well, then, I will. Of course, we would like to actually understand what this kind of a nonlinear processing does. Well, that's actually kind of very difficult in neural networks. That's a well-known problem of neural networks. How can you? It's very difficult to visualize 3 hidden layers in a neural network. But well, okay, I will just mention that we tried it and it can be found in the paper. I'll check the time. So then we extended this by into the case where we basically apply nonlinear ICA on innovations. That is that we basically build a model where we have an autoregressive model, and you know the what you add at every time point to the system is called innovations, or the driving noise of the system. And we can also assume that those residuals, so those innovations, actually follow nonlinear ICA. This is basically then modeling MEG data in a much richer way, where we actually have also taking into account temporal correlations in the data. And well, we get nice components, which are, well, I will not go into details here, but well, just to have a nice plot. But the interesting thing perhaps here is that, well, if we do this another classification, again we do a classification task using those nonlinear features obtained, and we see that, well, when we do this, use the innovations, we get even better classification accuracy than we get with the TCL, and much better classification accuracy than with competing nonlinear methods. Okay, but as I said earlier, we can actually have different kinds of temporal dependencies or temporal structure. And I actually had a plot with two different kinds, the autocorrelations and non-stationarity. So now I will talk about the other type, which is autocorrelations. So we are talking about stationary time series here with autocorrelations. What we could do then, well, we kind of apparently heuristically define a self-supervised problem, which is as follows. We now take short time windows as new data. In the very simplest case, just 2 consecutive time points as the new data, y. And then we create a kind of a randomized data set where we simply take 2 data points at random, 2 random time points, so basically destroying the time structure, temporal correlations in the data. And now we can train a neural network to discriminate these real-time windows from the shuffled time windows where the time structure has been destroyed. And again, obviously, well, if you think about it intuitively, the neural network should learn something about the temporal dependencies between 2 consecutive time points, because that is the thing that actually distinguishes these two data sets. And well, we can actually have another theorem. I will not go show that, but that shows that this way you can actually perform nonlinear ICA for temporally dependent components. So here's a simple illustration. I'm showing, this is actually the same data that I showed on an earlier slide showing the problem of non-identifiability. Now I will actually show that it can be identified when the data actually comes from a time series. So actually this data came, although I didn't say it, it came from a non-Gaussian autoregressive model with non-Gaussian innovations, in fact Laplacian innovations that we have here, absolute values, which gives us the log PDF of a Laplacian distribution. So as earlier, we have the sources here, we have the nonlinear mixtures. Now with PCL, we actually get this. And here we see that, well, we get quite a good correspondence with the original sources. Some estimation errors can be seen. And well, we can also plot kind of scatter plots of the real source signals and the estimates, and we see quite a good correspondence up to some nonlinear transformation, but still it's kind of a rather strict nonlinear correlation. While if we compare with the kind of a original method that was proposed for nonlinear ICA using temporal correlations, well, we beat them quite clearly. Now we actually use this for our most sophisticated biomedical application, which is analyzing EEG in a reasonably clinical, kind of realistic clinical applications. We had 2 applications here. One is sleep staging. So when you measure EEG during sleep, well, classically people define 5 different types or classes of sleep based on EEG. And the other data, we used another data set completely different, where we try to distinguish between ordinary kind of healthy EEG from pathological or abnormal EEG, which might be related to something like epilepsy or dementia, although actually in this case the labels are simply saying normal or abnormal. So these are, as I already mentioned, the case of semi-supervised problems. Well, I will explain that in a bit more clearly here. So a semi-supervised problem means something where you actually have a lot of data available, but it's mainly unlabeled. Almost all of it is unlabeled. And you can have some labeled data, but not much because it's somehow expensive. For example, you might need a human expert, which is exactly the case here. You need a medical doctor to tell for each kind of a segment of, well, a small patch of EEG, whether this is, which sleep stage this is, or whether this is normal or abnormal. So the point is that we can then combine these two ideas, just like in our MEG non-clinical cases. We first find nice features with unsupervised learning, that is nonlinear ICA or something similar, and after that use a simple linear classifier. Well, I'm afraid these figures here may not be very clear, but well, here's kind of the architecture. In deep learning, people like drawing this kind of graphs of the architecture. Actually, I don't even completely understand them myself, so I will not go into details. But the point is here, basically. So, yeah, so we have the labeling here is a bit different from earlier. So this paper doesn't actually use exactly PCL. It uses RP, relative positioning, which is like PCL, but slightly different. So the point is that, well, for methods that actually use semi-supervised learning, that is some kind of a nonlinear feature extraction first, you get quite a good performance, even with very few examples per class. So here we like 10 examples, labeled examples per class, which is like so 50 labeled time points for EEG, which is really not very much. Because you get very good features from the unlabeled data. Now here for comparison, we show here like basically handicrafted features which don't get that good. Sorry, I'm a little bit. So it's actually so small that even I cannot completely see it. But I believe that handicraft features are some of these lower things here, which don't. So it shows that the classification doesn't work that well. While for the semi-supervised methods, they are all actually very similar, and it works reasonably well even in the beginning. And for something like 100 or sorry, I said. I said 10 to the power of 0 is of course 1. So we actually start with I believe maybe just one data point per class. And here we have 10. And with 10 or 100, it actually works already quite well. But now the real point is that when we compare it with full supervision, that is kind of ordinary supervised learning, well, that works really badly in the beginning. And it only starts working when you have a lot of good examples, labeled examples per class, something like 1,000. So in this regime here, where you have like a few dozen labeled examples, or maybe a few hundred, the self-supervised or semi-supervised learning is extremely useful. Okay, I'm afraid I'm kind of running out of time. Yes. I will just very briefly mention the last case, a kind of a general framework, which relates to the well-known framework of deep latent variable models. So they are classically defined on this abstract level here. So we have some latent variables S, and then we observe x's, which according to some measurement distribution here. Well, it is actually something very similar to nonlinear ICA in practice, because often people define these measurement distributions so that actually fx is equal to f of s, just like in nonlinear ICA, plus n, which is something like Gaussian noise. So basically, we actually have a nonlinear ICA model which has noise. So this is how people usually define a model in the case of what is called variational autoencoders. So variational autoencoders is actually a slightly confusing terminology. It includes both this model as well as a method for estimating the model. But the basic case of variational autoencoders is completely not identifiable, because they define that these latent variables are white, that is uncorrelated, and Gaussian. So we get the same indeterminacy or unidentifiability as with linear Gaussian methods like PCA, factor analysis, and so on and so on, which I repeat here, which is that any orthogonal rotation is equivalent. Any orthogonal rotation has exactly the same distribution, so we cannot distinguish between them. But so what we did, okay, well, I will skip that. What we did is that we basically used this idea of temporal dependencies and kind of abstracted away that to a higher level so that we talk about some kind of an auxiliary variable which gives us more information. So auxiliary information could be something like the time index, like in TCL. It could be the history, like in the permutation contrastive learning. So these two are like in the like in the case of time structure. Sorry. It can also be something like we could use audio data as an auxiliary variable for video to provide some more information. And now the point is that if we assume that these latent variables are conditionally independent given U, but this auxiliary variable U somehow modulates the distributions of the independence strongly enough, then we can show that the model is identifiable. So this is what we call IVAE, as in identifiable VAE, or maybe independent VAE, if you like. So basically, the original VAE is more like PCA. It's not really ICA. So you get a nice manifold, so like a nonlinear subspace, if you like. But if you actually want to find the original latent variables, original components, you need something more, and this is what we gain by IVAE. Right, so we have various extensions, but in the interest of time, I will just show you this slide, and you can come back to it in the recording if you are interested. So I will go to the conclusion. So the starting point was that typical deep learning methods need class labels or some targets. If you have regression, it can be also like some output values. So if we have no such class labels or targets, then we get into the realm of unsupervised learning. Independent component analysis is a principled approach and widely used and reasonably well understood in the linear case. Now, whether we can make that nonlinear has been an important problem in recent years. So we show here, we have shown that it can actually be made nonlinear, although it's not straightforward. What we really need is in order to make it identifiable. So we want to make it identifiable, which means that we can recover the components that actually created the data. Unlike in methods like PCA and VAE, which are very nice, which give some kind of useful subspaces and manifolds, but which don't actually give you the original components. And now, in order to have this identifiability in the nonlinear case, you need some further conditions. Basically, one of these, well, we have shown that it works for one of these three cases. First, we can have temporal dependencies in the form of non-stationarity. We can have temporal structure in the sense of non-stationarity, or we can have temporal structure in the sense of temporal dependency, such as autocorrelations, or we can have some kind of an auxiliary additional variable that conditions the independent components, like in IVAE. This is by no means an exhaustive list. This is just the cases where we are able to prove the identifiability. So self-supervised methods are, well, we can do all these things actually, well, almost all of these things by using self-supervised methods, which actually have the nice feature that they are easy to implement because you don't necessarily need to program anything new. You just use existing software packages for supervised deep learning. And then I showed some promising applications on EG and MEG, but that research line is only in the very beginning, and I'm sure we can find many more interesting results there. Okay, thank you very much. That's all.
Thanks a lot, Aapo. I think we'll open the floor to questions. If you post them in the chat. I could. Shall I read them out for you?
No, I think I can see the chat because I can actually. Okay, maybe I stop. Oh well, I don't yet stop. Okay, I better stop sharing at this point.
If you have any question, you can type it into the chat box, or at this point you can raise a hand and ask questions as well. I was monitoring the chat box. I don't think there was a midway question being input there. So is there any question?
Shall I start?
Yeah, that sounds great. Yes.
Just going back to the relationship between your sources you're trying to recover and your additional variable. How dependent do the sources have to be on you for it to be recoverable?
Well, we have some technical conditions for that, but I don't really have like an independent. Sorry. Oh, I'm using the word independent so much that it comes like all the time. No, what I wanted to say, I don't have an intuitive explanation of how dependent they have to be. Yeah, I can't really answer that question. It's to a large extent, I suppose, maybe an empirical question. So we have the technical conditions, and then you may find them empirically fulfilled at some for some data sets and others not. I'm afraid I can't say much more than that. Okay, so now we got questions in the chat. I'm not sure if I understood correctly, but does the non-stationary time series estimation mean you can have Gaussian distributions? Yes, exactly. Yes. In fact, you need, if you have Gaussians whose variances are changing, then it works. If you have Gaussians where only the mean is changing, then no. But yes, if the variances are changing, then you can have Gaussian distributions. How different do the distributions have to be? Well, okay, so I suppose there's kind of two parts to answer this question. There's always the question of like identifiability, and then the question of some kind of a statistical efficiency and so on. So from the viewpoint of identifiability, what we actually have in this case is a condition of full rank. So if we have, I don't quite remember the exact form, but it's something like that. If we have n components, the variances, when you put the variances in different segments in a matrix, that has to have rank n, approximately something like that. So basically, fundamentally, if you have like, let's assume if you think that like the variances are created randomly, so then you would need like at least n segments. Now, of course, this is the condition for identifiability. Then in practice, what you might be more interested in is the question of like statistical efficiency. On that, we are actually kind of just starting to analyze that. So I cannot really say very much. Because identifiability is a slightly theoretical concept in the sense that it works when you have an infinite amount of data. It shows convergence. And for finite data, then the situation is different. It's a bit, maybe I should mention in this case, so like in the case of linear ICA, so the basic theory says that it works as long as the components are non-Gaussian. So then, of course, people ask that, okay, how non-Gaussian do they have to be? Well, again, the identifiability theory actually says that it's enough if they are just like an epsilon amount, epsilon non-Gaussian, just arbitrarily little different from Gaussian distribution. But then when you analyze the statistical efficiency, you will basically see that the amount of data that you need to achieve a given amount of accuracy, just it increases the closer you get to Gaussianity, and basically it asymptotes to infinity when you reach Gaussianity. So in practice, when we say that something has to be non-Gaussian, it means that it has to be non-Gaussian enough where enough depends then, on many practical constraints. So same thing here. So if I say that we have a full rank constraint on the variances to be able to have identifiability, then surely in practice, in order that to work, it's not enough that the matrix has full rank. It must also have somehow, a good condition number or something like that. Okay, how do you calculate the best length of a time segment in TCL? Yes. Well, one answer is that, well, in some unpublished results, we actually try to see whether we could use the classification accuracy to detect the correct length of time segment, assuming that the data actually follows the model with a known fixed, with a fixed segment length, and that seemed to work quite well. So you could just take the segment length that is gives the best classification accuracy. In more recent work, which I mentioned in the slide, which on extensions, which I just showed, I didn't explain it. We actually build a hidden Markov model so that you get rid of this problem of choosing the segment length or choosing the segmentation completely. Okay, next question. How would this? Yeah.
Sorry, I think Giovanni, the next question, he has camera on. Do you want to ask him, Aapo, directly?
Yes, maybe. Thank you. That's very kind. Basically, I'm very interested in the application of these methods. I mean, I've come from a group which was using ICA on EMG, which is a muscle activity, and looking at deep muscles, the cocktail party problem, etc. Those sorts of things. But I would be more interested in applying this to biomechanical variables, which is more relating to knee angle or joint angles or joint moments, which is the sort of the more traditional approach. But clearly we have a mechanical system which is connected, so a knee angle and hip angle are not completely independent. So basically, how would we know the relationship somehow between them, that they are part of on both ends of the same bone? There's some sort of similar like mechanical links between them. Would that be using the? I thought the autocorrelation approach might be very helpful, because we can think of it as some kind of a wavelet kind of approach. Thinking of that there is always a shape to this wave, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's asking if it's clear enough.
So you mean it's a question that what can you do when you know that the actual quantities of interest are dependent,
but you know something about the dependence?
Well, that's a bit difficult to say at this point. So, like in linear ICA, what happened is that, well, after people developed a theory of linear ICA, then there was a lot of work on modeling various kinds of dependencies between the components, which are, of course, like highly
like synergies.
Yeah, I suppose you could call it like that. Yes, I think you call it in motor control.
Yes, you call it synergies.
Yes. Which are to some extent, of course, application dependent, but also at the same time, I think there are certain kinds of dependencies that are quite not universal, but can be found in many different applications. So maybe the next wave of nonlinear ICA or disentanglement self-supervised learning research might build models where we actually have dependent components in some sense. It's obviously something that people always mention.
No, but I like
when people talk about independent components. Yes.
No, but can I just ask if it's linked back to that length of time request? Because basically, if you make the time longer, then you get more certain features inside, right? If you have biological features, right? Biological processes happen on a certain time scale, right?
Yeah.
So if you choose the time scale very short, then you'll be dealing with electrophysiological processes. If you choose longer time frames, you'll be dealing with more mechanical, because they're much slower.
Right. Okay. Yes, that's interesting. That's a very interesting point. So it might actually be that depending on the time scale you are analyzing, you might get different independent components.
Yes,
that's a possibility. That's a very interesting possibility. Actually, we don't have it in any of our models, but yeah, it might happen. Yes.
Okay. I'd love to talk to you more about this in another call, but thanks.
We really haven't actually taken that into account in our models at all.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So that was your question. So I think the next one is, what are the constraints on number of observation channels versus number of underlying sources in nonlinear ICA? Well, at the current stage of research, the theory talks about the case where the number of observation channels equals the number of underlying sources. What that means in practice is that the number of observation channels should be at least as large as the number of underlying sources, because, well, actually some of the methods in fact are able to also reduce the dimension so that you can have more observation channels than you have underlying sources. Yes. Now it is conceivable that at some future time point, somebody will develop theory for the case where the number of independent components is larger than the number of observation channels. This has happened in the linear case, but the theory gets much more complicated, especially the estimation methods get much more complicated. So people don't usually use those methods too much. Well, in some cases, sure they do, but in the nonlinear case, we are not that far yet. But hopefully we will be able to cover that case as well. Another question. Deep neural networks. Sorry.
Sorry, the next question might be quite sort of long and complicated. Would you like to ask in person, Mikrai? Are you around? Perhaps. If not, yeah, Aapo, if you could go ahead and answer, that would be great.
Yeah, actually, sure. I can ask. Yeah. Hello.
Hello.
Thank you very much for a great talk. So basically, I mean, I'm from the background of mostly EEG and MEG research, and it's great methods. And basically, what I was about to ask is how much data we need for pre-training this kind of encoders for extracting representations, right? Because ICA is typically used for single subject data sets and so on, and how practical it is for typically small EEG and MEG data sets.
Yes, I mean deep learning usually requires a lot of data. Yes, much more than any linear method for sure. It's very difficult to give any numbers, but I would say that anything less than 10,000 data points is probably not going to work. Then, but of course with MEG and EEG, 10,000 data points is not that impossible. So yes, it might be possible to do it on a single subject data set in EEG or MEG, but then you would probably need reasonably long data sets. Difficult to give any numbers, but surely like at least one order of magnitude more than in the linear ICA case.
Yeah, I see.
That's always the problem with deep learning. You always need a lot of data. Yes.
Another interesting thing might be to kind of utilize the population level data from many participants to build the generalized representation and then just deploy it for classification. I suppose you tried it times before.
Yes, actually, I should mention that in our earliest results for MEG, which I showed with time contrast deep learning, we had measurements of something like 10 minutes, I believe, and we found that it's not enough. So we had a very small data set, so we combined something like 10 subjects, and then it worked much better. So, okay, so that gives you maybe some idea of the scale of data needed. Well, yeah, so we didn't really build an explicit model of individual differences or anything. We used some reasonably simple methods for combining all the data, not just concatenating it all. That didn't work, but we had some. Well, I forget. My postdoc used some method for like smartly combining data from different subjects, but I forget how it actually happened.
Right. Cool. Thank you very much. I will look it up.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, I think I answered all the questions in the chat. Did I?
Yes. And So I think we could conclude the seminar part of the of your visit, Aapo. But if you can stick around a few more minutes, perhaps some people want to actually turn up the camera and meet with you. And
Yeah,
so,
sure. Yes.
yeah. So I will stop recording. But Alex, let's thank Aapo officially for the fantastic talk and
Thank you.
thank you very much.